Okay, so think about how many choices we make every single day,
Loads of them.
right?
Yeah.
Trivial stuff, things we need to decide right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Hundreds, maybe thousands.
But then there are those other
Yeah.
decisions, the ones with consequences that stretch out, for years. We're calling them farsighted choices.
Mm-hmm. The big ones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And making those, well, that's a skill, a really important one that honestly we probably don't think about consciously enough.
That's really the heart of what we're getting into today. We've gone through quite a bit of material you send over articles, research findings, even some of your own notes. Really interesting stuff.
Good.
And our mission, really, in this deep dive is to pull out the most important insights from all that. The goal is to give you some practical ways to, handle that complexity and make those bigger choices feel a bit less daunting.
It is kind of humbling, isn't it, when you realize that despite everything, all our tech and data,
Yeah.
the basic way we wrestle with the really hard, long-view decisions
Hmm.
hasn't fundamentally changed much, not in centuries, really.
It's true. Our tools are different, maybe, but the underlying mental machinery, pretty much the same.
So that's what we're exploring. We're looking for strategies to help you broaden your perspective, maybe recognize some of your own thinking traps,
Yeah.
and crucially, spot possibilities you might have otherwise missed.
Exactly. And a good starting point is how we even look at the range of possibilities. Our sources mentioned Philip Tetlock's work on the fox versus the hedgehog. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, the fox and the hedgehog.
Oh,
Okay, so Tellock used this old saying, right? The fox knows many little things,
Right.
while the hedgehog knows one big thing. And his research found that the foxes, the ones who draw on lots of different ideas, are okay with uncertainty, kind of adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
They were consistently better at long-range forecasting.
Mm-hmm.
And that applies directly to making good long-term decisions.
So the fox approach is better for this farsighted thinking.
Yeah, it seems so. It's about pulling from diverse sources, not getting locked into just one way of seeing things, especially when the stakes are high. So, for your own big decisions, are you actively being a fox, seeking out different views, or leaning more hedgehog?
It's interesting, though, because being a hedgehog can feel quite appealing, can't it? That single, clear focus. It feels strong.
Yeah, simpler.
But the sources really flag a danger there, especially for looking ahead. It leads straight into what they call the fallacy of extrapolation.
Ah, right. Assuming today's trend just keeps going forever.
Exactly. Like assuming a sunny day means sunshine for the next decade.
Yeah.
It's a very blinkered view of the future.
Yeah, and you end up with a really fuzzy picture, or worse, a completely wrong one. As one piece put it, you can't be farsighted if your view is clouded by, well, simplistic assumptions.
Which leads us nicely into thinking about our own sort of built-in limitations, our cognitive limits. We all like to think we're pretty rational, weighing things up carefully, but the reality, much messier. Take the Dunning-Kruger effect. The finding that people who are least skilled in an area often rate their ability the highest.
Right. Overconfidence where it's least warranted.
It's a good reminder, isn't it? Sometimes the more certain someone sounds, the more careful we should be.
It is humbling, and it connects straight to Herbert Simon's idea, bounded rationality.
Yes. Explain that a bit.
Well, Simon basically said, look, in the real world, we don't have perfect information. We don't have infinite brain power or time.
Right. We're limited.
Exactly. Our rationality is bounded by the info we do have, our own mental limits, the clock ticking. It really pushes back against those old economic models of the perfectly rational person.
It absolutely does. And some of the research we looked at from the book Decisive really nails this in practice. Paul Nutt's work.
What did he find?
He found that most organizations, when making a decision, seriously considered only one alternative.
Wow, just one.
Just one. And yet other studies consistently show this strong link the more options you genuinely explore.
The better the final decision tends to be.
Exactly. A much higher success rate. It makes you wonder how many great ideas just, never even get considered.
It really does. And then there's Donald Rumsfeld's famous phrase.
Ah, the known unknowns.
Yeah, it got kind of made fun of, but the point behind it is actually really important for decision-making, isn't it?
Totally. We have to acknowledge what we don't know. It's so easy, so tempting to just focus on the stuff we understand, the things we can measure easily, and kind of push aside or undervalue the uncertainties, the things that are harder to grasp.
Right, the opaque variables.
Precisely. So, okay, given these limitations, these biases, what strategies did the sources suggest for actually making better long-term choices?
Well, a big one was about learning to kind of embrace uncertainty. Sounds odd, maybe.
How so?
Well, just accepting that the future isn't set in stone is actually the first step to navigating it better.
Hmm.
And tied to that is actively challenging your own assumptions.
Okay, so questioning yourself.
Yeah. Don't just run with your first instinct or belief. Push on it. Ask, where did this come from? Are there other ways to look at this?
And a really practical way to do that is to deliberately hunt for evidence that contradicts what you think.
Right. Confirmation bias is so powerful, we naturally look for things that agree with us.
We all do it.
But the real insights, the breakthroughs, often come when you grapple with the stuff that challenges your view.
Makes sense. Find the disconfirming evidence.
Yeah. And it's not just about picking between option A and option B. It's also about trying to discover option C or D.
Finding new possibilities altogether.
Exactly. The Highline Park in New York is such a great example, right? That old elevated railway track.
Uh-huh.
The choice wasn't just tear it down or let it rot. Someone imagined something completely different, a park in the sky.
A brilliant third option.
Yeah. And the sources suggested that being willing to face doubt, to sit with uncertainty, can actually spark that kind of creativity. It helps you find those novel solutions.
That's a fantastic point about creativity. And thinking about groups making decisions, Scott Page's idea, diversity trumps ability, came up.
Ah, yes. Tell us about that.
Well, the research suggests that diverse groups, like racially mixed juries, for instance, often make better, more accurate decisions than homogeneous groups, even if the individuals in the homogeneous group are supposedly smarter.
Interesting. So diversity brings different perspectives.
Exactly. And you can even create that cognitive diversity within an existing team by using expert roles, like assigning someone to be the devil's advocate or to specifically look at long-term risks. It forces different angles.
That's a smart tactic to avoid groupthink.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's group dynamics. What about tools for individuals trying to map out these complex long-term things?
Well, the sources mention influence diagrams.
Right, like flowcharts for decisions.
Kind of. They're visual tools, often used in things like environmental planning, to map out all the different factors and how they might connect and influence each other. It helps you see those maybe less obvious links.
Okay, so getting a clearer picture of the whole system.
Exactly. So we've talked perspective, limitations, finding options. What about the actual process, the nuts and bolts?
Right. Well, the sources sort of outlined a basic three-step approach for more deliberate decisions.
Okay.
First, map things out. Identify the variables, the potential paths you could take. Second, predict the outcomes for each path, realistically.
Mm-hmm.
And third, weigh those predicted outcomes against what you're actually trying to achieve, your objectives.
That sounds very methodical.
It is. And it ties in really well with Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking.
Ah, the fast and slow thinking.
Exactly. System 1 is that fast, intuitive gut reaction thinking. System 2 is the slower, more analytical, effortful kind.
Right.
And for these big, long-term, far-sighted decisions, the sources really hammer home. You need to engage System 2. You need to focus on the process of deciding, not just hoping for a good outcome.
That's such a crucial distinction. We tend to judge decisions only by whether they worked out well in the end, right?
Yeah, outcome bias.
Yeah. But we often ignore how good the thinking behind the decision was. And as one source put it, we focus on results, not the process, but a solid process.
It's like defining the problem clearly, exploring options properly, weighing evidence.
That's what makes good long-term outcomes much more likely. It's not foolproof, but it stacks the odds in your favor.
Definitely. Though the sources did acknowledge sometimes you do need to act fast.
Sure, intense time pressure.
Yeah. And in those cases, that System 1 gut instinct, if it's built on real experience, can be really valuable. The trick is knowing when to trust the gut and when to slow down and use System 2.
Discerning which system is appropriate. Okay, let's make this more concrete. The sources offered some great historical examples, didn't they?
They did. There was Charles Darwin wrestling with whether to get married. He actually made a pro-con list.
Seriously, like literally.
Yeah, at 29. It's quite funny, actually. Pros included things like constant companion, friend in old age. Cons, terrible loss of time, less money for books.
Huh. Very practical. It shows how even deeply personal choices involve this kind of weighing up.
Totally. And even then, as the sources noted, he couldn't foresee everything, like the later intellectual clashes he had with his wife over religion stemming from his scientific work.
So even careful deliberation has limits.
And then you had Benjamin Franklin and his moral or prudential algebra.
Ah, yes. A more systematic approach.
Very much so, almost mathematical. listing reasons for and against, assigning weights, canceling them out. It's like an early version of decision analysis, showing people have been trying to rationalize tough choices for ages.
That drive for a logical framework seems perennial. But history also gives us examples where things went wrong, even with deliberation.
Oh, definitely. George Washington's decision during the Revolutionary War trying to defend both Manhattan and Brooklyn.
What went wrong there?
Well, the sources suggest things like loss aversion, not wanting to give up either piece of ground, played a role. That, plus bad intel, because his key general was sick, it led to a major strategic mistake. The British took New York. A huge blow.
So, psychological biases and bad information combined.
Seems like it. And then there's the story of Collect Pond in Manhattan.
Collect Pond? What happened there?
It used to be a freshwater source, but it got badly polluted, so the city decided to fill it in. Seemed logical, right? Create new land for development.
Okay, makes sense on the surface.
But the fill wasn't stable. It was basically decomposing garbage. Houses built on it started sinking, disease spread.
Oh, no.
And it eventually became the infamous five-point slum, a short-term solution with absolutely disastrous long-term consequences.
Whoa, that's a powerful example of needing to think about second and third order effects, not just the immediate result.
Exactly. Truly farsighted thinking demands looking at those ripples over time.
These historical cases really drive home the complexity, the potential for unintended outcomes.
Which kind of leads us to the role of imagination and maybe simulation in doing better. And one interesting idea from the sources was about reading novels.
Reading novels helps decision-making. How does that work?
Well, the idea is that when you get lost in a good novel, you're constantly putting yourself in other people's shoes, understanding their motives, simulating different scenarios in your head.
Ah, like exercising your empathy and perspective-taking muscles?
Exactly. And some research apparently links reading literary fiction with better theory of mind, basically, understanding what others are thinking and feeling. Books like George Eliot's Middlemarch, which delves deep into complex choices and motivations.
They're like a workout for navigating real-life complexity.
Kinda, yeah. It's mental prep. And then you look at really high-stakes situations like the planning for the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound.
That was incredibly detailed, wasn't it?
Amazingly so. 9 months of debate. SEAL Team 6 ran countless simulations, accounting for climate, terrain, everything they could think of. They had backup plans for their backup plans.
Trying to anticipate everything that could go wrong.
Yeah. And it highlights that effort to grapple with the known unknowns. Like, they even had to figure out a way to measure his height on the spot to confirm identity.
Right.
But even with all that, things went wrong. The unexpected wind current that downed a helicopter.
A true unknown unknown, or maybe an underestimated known unknown.
Yeah. It shows there's always uncertainty. And you have to remember the huge disagreements within Obama's team, the massive long-term geopolitical risks they were weighing. It wasn't simple.
Absolutely not. And thinking bigger scale, those U.S. military fleet problems simulations before Pearl Harbor,
What about them?
those war games actually predicted that more aircraft carriers were needed to defend against an air attack in the Pacific.
Wow. They saw it coming.
The simulations pointed strongly that way. But for various reasons, that lesson wasn't fully absorbed or acted upon, and the consequences at Pearl Harbor were, well, tragic.
A failure to heed the results of simulation. That's sobering. Okay, so moving from history and simulation, how do we actively build this foresight? How do we overcome our own blind spots?
Well, a key point from the sources is that we often need help with that. We need others or structured processes to help us think around our blind spots.
Because our bias is overconfidence, confirmation bias can really sabotage us, especially once we have an opinion.
Exactly. And that's where something like scenario planning comes in.
Tell me more about that.
It's basically a structured way to imagine different possible futures. Not just predicting one future, but exploring a range, maybe a best case, a worst case, and maybe a weird case. Something totally unexpected.
So you're forced to consider alternatives.
Right. It forces you to challenge your core assumptions about how things will unfold. It makes your strategy more robust because you've thought about how it might hold up under different conditions.
It sounds like building that map of potential futures we talked about earlier.
It is. And the bottom line here really is that every single decision involves predicting the future to some degree. And predictions always have uncertainty attached.
Always. No crystal balls.
No. So we have to accept that uncertainty, try to understand it as best we can, and make it part of the decision process itself.
Now, these long-term decisions often have ethical dimensions too, don't they? The sources touched on utilitarianism.
Yeah, Briefly, the idea from thinkers like Bentham and Mill about maximizing happiness or well-being, the greatest good for the greatest number, thinking about things in terms of pleasure and pain.
And how does that play out today?
Well, you see echoes of it in things like government regulatory impact analyses.
Where they try to put a value on things.
Well, sometimes, yeah. Trying to quantify the costs and benefits of a new rule, maybe even putting a dollar value on, say, preventing injuries or saving lives, to weigh against the costs of the regulation. Reagan's Executive Order 1291 mandated that kind of cost-benefit analysis for major rules.
Right, a pragmatic, maybe slightly cold, way to apply those ethical ideas to policy.
Some would say so. And looking even further out, some decisions we face now have potentially massive species-level consequences.
Like what?
Well, the MIDI project actively trying to send signals to other potential civilizations out there.
Ah, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence.
Right. And people like David Brin, Stephen Hawking before he passed, raised concerns. Historically, when advanced and less advanced cultures meet.
It often doesn't go well for the less advanced one.
That's the worry. Is it wise to shout into the cosmic forest without knowing who might be listening?
A huge known unknown right there.
Definitely. And similar debates swirl around super intelligent AI.
Right. Figures like Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Hawking, again warning about potential existential risks down the line.
Yeah, most experts think it's still decades away if it happens at all, but the potential impact is so huge.
That we need to think about it now.
Exactly. It raises questions about needing careful thought, maybe even global oversight for technologies that have even a tiny risk of, well, ending badly for everyone.
It really broadens the scope of Farsighted. And then there are questions like, should we aim to cure death?
Another big one. The sources mention that often when people are asked, they'd prefer longer, healthier, more meaningful lives rather than actual immortality.
Interesting.
Which then opens up all sorts of questions. Who decides? What are the societal impacts? It highlights the need for broad input on these huge questions. Initiatives like Obama's Citizens Briefing book were an attempt to get that wider public perspective on priorities.
So tapping into collective wisdom for these really big long-term societal choices.
Precisely. Because no single person or small group has all the answers. And just as a final interesting little side note from the sources, periods of big change might actually slow down how we perceive time.
Really? Why would that be?
The idea is maybe because we're forced to process more information, to engage more deliberately, like using that system to thinking more often.
Huh. That's fascinating. So navigating big changes, making those far-sighted choices, it might literally feel like time is stretching a bit.
Potentially. It suggests the very act of grappling with the stuff might change our subjective experience.
Okay, so pulling all this together, making truly far-sighted choices isn't easy. It takes real conscious effort.
Definitely. It's not the default mode.
It means being willing to seek out different views, really poke holes in your own assumptions, and get comfortable with the fact that the future is uncertain.
You have to embrace that ambiguity almost.
Yeah, and the strategies we talked about, being more like the fox, using scenario planning, they aren't magic bullets. They're more like prompts, nudges, ways to help you step outside your usual thinking patterns.
Exactly. They're tools to cultivate a more thoughtful, more deliberate, and ultimately more expansive way of approaching those really impactful decisions, the ones that shape your future, and maybe ours too.
So the next time you're facing a significant choice, maybe pause and ask yourself, how can I be more fox-like here? Could I sketch out a few different scenarios for how this might play out?
Good questions to ask.
What are the known unknowns I might be ignoring right now? And maybe focus less on just predicting the perfect outcome and more on the quality of the thinking, the process you're using to get there.
It's about improving the process continually.
Exactly. It's a learning curve. Hopefully this deep dive gave you some useful things to chew on for that journey.